Hamas and all that, and drinking coffee, and I was kind of putting some thoughts down for today, and I looked up and it was 8:45, and I hadn't shaved in 3 days, and so I was just like, oh my, I can't believe we made it. What are you laughing at? I am. Would you get that door for me? Thank you. Well, it's good to be back. Good to be back with y'all this morning. Oh, I'm sorry. Mark says I'm yelling, and I'm just talking. Can you hear me okay, Juanita? I can. Back here. Okay, I'll move up. Y'all are so much fun. I enjoy this so much. It's been a long, long time. It seems like it's been a long, long time since I've had opportunity to speak with y'all, to facilitate a class with y'all. It's one of my favorite things to do here. This summer, we were at Camp Bandina. Hello, I just changed. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Now we need to go up a little bit. Well, I don't know. Can you hear me okay? What? Huh?
I think it turned off, because you went to nothing.
I still have a green light. But anyway, so they had this one day where there was a song leader, teacher kind of a guy, and a worship leader and it was teaching new songs and how to break down songs and all those things. And he said something that just kind of stabbed me in the heart. And he goes, when we get to heaven, there's not going to be any teaching or preaching or any of that kind of stuff. It'll just be singing. I just went, oh, because I can't sing, so it's
You'll be able to there.
joyful noise, perhaps, we asked Clint Mulholland several months ago this spring to head up, the adult Bible classes and get teachers and that sort of thing, and he's done a fantastic job. He has a lot of people now. We have a good variety of people, so you're not always going to be stuck with the same people up here all the time. But I am glad to be back with y'all this morning. But we do have a lot of good, talented teachers we have right now. We're starting a new series this morning. I can't remember. Clint will have to remind me. I can't remember how long it is. I'm thinking 7 to 9 weeks is kind of what I think I have allocated for this. We're going to start a study on, call it Lessons from Simon Peter, right? So we're going to look at some of the lessons that Simon Peter can give us, right? So it seems to me that we don't talk about Peter as much. We tend to rely on the Apostle Paul more than any other writer in the Bible, and you know what? Rightly so. Have you ever looked at how many, what percentage, say, of the New Testament that the Apostle Paul wrote? Do y'all know that? If you include, say it, Juanita. 80? That's a bit high, but not bad. I mean, it's 50%, right? There are 27 books in the New Testament. Yeah, if you include the Gospels, right? And people would ask, rightly so, why would you say if you include the Gospels in the New Testament? Well, remember that everything that happened in the Gospels, right, it happened under Mosaical law. So, I mean, a lot of people don't include the Gospels in the New Testament. I do, because a new dispensation was introduced in the gospel. So about 50% of the New Testament, again, if you include the Gospels in the New Testament, were written by Paul. He wrote 13 of the 27 books. He was very intelligent, right? Very well educated. And according to his education, he himself said that he was does anybody know? Paul was he was a Pharisee. If you look at Acts 23, verse 6, he said his father was a Pharisee, he's a Pharisee, that sort of thing, as opposed to Pharisees, Sadducees, that sort of thing. And he was a zealot, right? Everybody knows that Saul was a zealot. He was very passionate about the law and upholding the law, every dot and tittle, right? That he was very much a zealot. And like most zealots, if you can convert them to your cause, you get an Apostle Paul who did a lot of good things. However, we tend to not refer or quote Peter nearly as often. Now, why is that? Well, okay, number one, he didn't write as much. He wrote 2 books, right? 1st and 2nd Peter. But in those 2 books, there's an awful lot in there. One of which is devoted more to looking out for false teachers, that sort of thing. And then the other one is a lot more counsel and wisdom in 1 Peter. Also, it seems like to me that when we do refer to Peter, right, when we talk about Peter very much, we tend to talk about his mistakes. Now, truly, he made a few boo-boos, a few gaffes, and the gaffes that he made were pretty big, and we are going to talk about those things. But it's almost like when we talk about Peter that we say, well, if Peter, can make it, then we can make it, because he was kind of he kind of messed up a few times, right? The biggest thing about it, though, is if you think about Peter's life, if you think about the things that he did, right? He was chosen for some pretty big things, right? Peter was chosen to do some very big things, and we're going to look at all of those things. And another reason I want to see what y'all think about this, that we don't refer to Peter as much as we do Paul or John, right? The Apostle John. Might be because the Roman Catholic Church has sort of grabbed onto Peter as that's a no. I got a kind of a no shrug from Mark. What do y'all think? I just went out there on my own on that? Okay, I did. All right, cool. I can deal with that. So I think a deep dive into Simon Peter will be very beneficial to us. How are we going to do that? So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to look at Peter's activities and his saying in the gospel. So we'll go through primarily the 3 synoptic gospels. I've really chosen Luke more than any other gospel. So if you want to read and kind of get ahead, that sort of thing, and read the Gospel of Luke and pay particular attention to what Peter is doing in the Gospel of Luke, and then Mark as well. Once we get through that, then we're going to go through Acts a little bit and look at those things that Peter did in Acts. You'll find those are pretty big. And then finally, we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Peter, right? We're going to look at some themes, some thoughts from 1st and 2nd Peter. But first, before we get into Peter and his actions, his sayings, his thoughts, that sort of thing, I want to know, because when you get into talking about an apostle, right, or a follower of Jesus in the Bible, you see the terms disciple a lot, and you see the term apostle a lot, right? Have you ever been confused by the difference between a disciple and an apostle? And have you ever been curious about what the difference between those two are? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, we're going to look at verse 10, right? It's kind of deep into it a little bit, but I thought we would define disciple and apostle, talk about the difference of those things, and kind of what it was like in Judaism to be a disciple.
Well, every apostle was a disciple, but not every disciple is a...
Have you been reading my notes? Right? It's just in there. It's fairly simple, but there's enough confusion out there, I think, that I thought it would be worth doing. Matthew chapter 9, verse 10. Now it happened, as Jesus sat at the table in the house. So if you go back a little bit, some context, Matthew or Levi had just been called, right? And he was a tax collector. And when Jesus said to Matthew, follow me, he just dropped everything, walked out the door, and followed Jesus. But they went to Matthew's house, and they were having a dinner. Now it happened, as Jesus sat at the table in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So that word that's used in Greek right there is mathetes. Mathetes. And what mathetes means, and don't forget, I don't speak Greek, I have a Strong's Concordance that I highly recommend. You can download it. It's an app. You can look. There's all kinds of neat things you can do with it, and they use the King James version, but it's fine. It matches up really well with the New King James version. Imagine that. And just kind of as an aside, as a study tool, a concordance is a wonderful thing. When you start thinking about Bible study or that sort of, and I hear a lot of times people say, don't just read it, right? You have to get in there and study. Well, I disagree with that, right? The way I study the Bible is I just read, right? I just pick books and just start reading, and then something piques my interest, and in that, then I will do a deep dive and a concordance, a Greek concordance, and then Old Testament, it has Hebrew, and it really helps to define what these words really mean. So mathetes means a learner or a pupil, right? So in Judaism, a disciple of a rabbi, right? So they would so just looking that up and kind of looking at that made me do a deep dive into the relationship between a rabbi and his disciple, right? Or his learner, his student. So at the time of Jesus, before and after, maybe in that 400-year silence, between the Old Testament and the coming of Jesus in the New Testament, it was probably this way, that a child, boys and girls, right, they started their religious education when they were about 5 years old. And that went from 5 to about 12 to 13 years old in the home, right? Their parents taught them in the home. And then about 12 or 13 years old, if a boy was intelligent and showed interest in continuing their religious studies, they would begin to look for a rabbi, right? And they would find this rabbi. How's Will today? Yeah, I'll bet he is. Will is dealing with, Will's a little under the weather right now with some kidney stones, and so he needs 4. Yeah, he is. I took him to the doctor the other day. He looked a little sleepy, so I didn't. Anyway, and they said he has 4 kidney stones working. Anyway, bless his heart. So they would begin to look for a rabbi, right? So they had that, different. You had Pharisees, Sadducees. You had, all, and now you've got. They still do the same thing. They've got Orthodox. They've got Hasidic. Hello, Esther. And all of different. So they would look for a rabbi that kind of went along with their view of things, and so then they would be with that rabbi. They would begin to follow that rabbi from 12 or 13 years old to mid to late 20s until about 30 years old, when they would graduate, if you will, from that. And then they could become a rabbi themselves at about 30 years old. Interesting, huh? 30 years old or so. It's about the time Jesus started his ministry, right? So a disciple of a rabbi, they would actually live with that rabbi all the time, right? And they would travel from town to town, and they would teach, and they would serve in that town, and they would study, and they were actually the servant of that rabbi. In other words, they would make camp, they would break down camp, they would do all of the things they needed to do, they would cook his food, do all of the things they needed to do, for that rabbi. So it was that kind of a relationship that they had with that rabbi. Interesting. Rabbi, that term rabbi, or rabboni, right? Hebrew word, obviously, is commonly used to mean teacher, and it does mean that, right? It does mean teacher, but it means more than that, right? It actually, when you say rabbi, you're saying my master. When you say that, when you say rabbi, you're saying my master. So if it means teacher, and my master, it makes that Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, when Jesus is talking about, do this, do that, don't call somebody that, I'm going to read it real quick. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 8. It gives that more meaning, right? So it says, the same day the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, I think that's the right spot. Nope, it's not it. I'm on the wrong page. Forgive me. 23:8. Yeah, there we go. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make, I'm not even going to try that one, phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feast, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi, teacher, teacher, or my master, my master. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. So it gives that a little bit more. Do not call somebody Rabbi. Rather than just don't call them your teacher, don't call them my master, right? Because it gives that a little bit more teeth. Okay, so disciple means student, it means pupil, it means servant. I got you. It means servant. It means all of those things at one time. And that disciple attached himself to that rabbi, his master, his teacher, all of those things for 10 to 15 years, right? I mean, that's quite a long time to be that student. Kelvin?
You know, when you read through these verses and you go down there to verse 8, don't be called rabbi, father, so forth, teacher, does that apply to us today? Is what I've been asked before, and I've asked the same question too.
Yeah.
Because he's directed
Well,
disciples and the 12
mm-hmm.
and the Pharisees and the scribes,
And the multitudes.
multitude.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So does it apply? So again, you have to look. So you look at. I mean, I called my dad my father when I introduced him. For example, this is my father, Harry Thomas or whatever, which is kind of ironic. Anyway, so does it apply? I think it applies, but you have to keep it in context. It's what you mean when you call a person rabbi, right? What do you mean by that? Do you mean teacher, or do you mean my master, right? Or when you call a person father, you know what I mean? I think it depends on how you're using it in context. But yeah, I think it applies. One day Hunter was here, and I was facilitating this class. I don't want to say I was teaching this class right now, right? But he called me rabbi, and it made me stop for a minute. I go, ooh, don't do that. Don't do that. That kind of bothers me. So then what is an apostle? So turn with me to Luke. Again, I just really gotten into Luke late. Chapter 6.
Did they have the written word at that time?
They had scripture, right? They had the Torah. They had, and more than that, right? They had pretty much most of the Old Testament, right? The law, the prophet, Genesis, the first 5, plus the prophets.
I was asking that because if they had to learn everything,
Which they did.
yes,
Yeah, they memorized it.
10 years to memorize it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's what they were doing.
That's why they
Yeah.
didn't graduate till they were 30.
Right. That's exactly right. And that's why, too, so, I mean, that's a really good point, Esther and Cheryl. It's a really good point because, so when Jesus, on the cross said, my God, why have you forsaken me? People that had studied recognized that immediately, right, from the Old Testament, from the scriptures that they had, right? They would recognize quotes when Jesus would quote something, or that's why Matthew, I don't know off the top of my head how many prophecies that Matthew recorded as having been fulfilled by Jesus. They recognized it immediately, right? Because they had studied all of those years and memorized, the law and the prophets and judges and all of those things. So yeah, they had it, and that's what they were studying, right? Now, what was different was one rabbi from, say, a Sadducee, one, they had different views on what those meant. I mean, remember that Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection of the dead, but the Pharisees did. Right? And so there's a different sects that would interpret things a little bit differently. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Right? Yes, ma'am?
Another point is, it wasn't studied by the general populace. They had to rely on the news they got from a select few because they didn't have printed, written word for every house, da-da-da-da-da.
Well,
So,
yeah, but the education of the children, say from 5 to say 12 to 13, was the responsibility of the parents.
right.
So they had something, that they were studying. Or they would go into the synagogue, study that, or listen to what was talked about in the synagogue, and then expand on that at home. But they were pretty well educated, for that time, by the time they got to 12, 13 years old. Both boys and girls, But then it was the boys that went on if they wanted to. All right, Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 12. Luke chapter 6, verse 12. I need to slow down a little bit, don't I, Cheryl? Sorry. Who said yes? You did? Sorry, Bobby. I do. Let me slow down a little bit. Well, I have a lot written down. And I want you to get all. Luke chapter 6, verse 12. Starting in verse 12. Now it came to pass in those days that he, Jesus, went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. Now that's interesting. I'm sorry. That's not the point. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. I'm going to stop right there. Notice that very often in that, and this is not the point here, but very often Jesus, before he made a big decision or did something big, he went off by himself and prayed about it, right? Give me guidance, whatever the case may be. Anyway, but apostles, that word, those 12 apostles. And like Mark said, all of the apostles were disciples, learners, pupils, servants of that master, right? But not all of the disciples were apostles. And when he says things like the multitude gathered together, I just wonder how many of those were hangers-on and how many were actually disciples. I think he had a lot of disciples. But Greek, that word is apostolos, right? Boom, apostolos, right? And it means, now this is important, right? Several years ago, there was a movie called The Apostle with Gus McCrae. Robert Duvall, thank you. Robert Duvall, right? And I for some reason, that kind of stuck in my craw, calling himself an apostle, because what that means is, it means a delegate, specifically an ambassador of the gospel, and officially a commissioner of Christ with miraculous powers. Right? So if you think about those 12 apostles when they were sent out later, right, when Jesus sent them out, and that's in Luke 9, 1 through 6, not much later. But, they did a lot of things, and we'll look at that. Why don't we look at that? Luke chapter 9. Verses 1 through 6, and then 10. Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. So a delegate, specifically an ambassador of the gospel, of the good news, right? And officially a commissioner of Christ with miraculous powers. Chapter 9, verse 1. Then he called his 12 disciples, and so that 12 disciples, those are the apostles, together, and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God. So right there, and heal the sick. So right there you have a delegate, you have an ambassador for Christ with specific miraculous powers. I don't think you can have an apostle today. Anyway. And he said to them, take nothing for the journey, neither staffs nor bags nor bread nor money, and do not have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And whoever will not receive you when you go out of that city Shake off the very dust from your feet as a testimony against them. So they departed and went through towns preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Then go over to verse 10. Then he says, and the apostles, so that's the 12. And the apostles, when they returned, told all that they had done. Then he took them and went aside privately into a deserted place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. Anyway, a delegate, ambassador, commissioner of Christ with miraculous powers. That's an apostle. Cool. I hope that was helped. Anyway. Okay. Now, let's turn to Luke chapter 5. Let's talk a little bit about Peter. Luke chapter 5. Verses 1 through 9. Luke chapter 5. And what I want to talk about here is Peter's response. Right? And so what we want to do is look at these qualities, these actions, these sayings and thoughts from Peter and see how we apply those to ourselves today, which we can. Okay? Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. Interesting. Go back up to 4, verse 38. And to set the context here, it hadn't been that long, not long at all, since Jesus has had the 3 temptations from Satan after having been baptized, right? And being led into the wilderness by Satan, and being tempted, and he came out from there and he started his ministry, right? And he cast out demons and he healed the sick, and John the Baptist had started his ministry. And looking in chapter 4, verse 38, this is interesting. Before it even talks about Peter at all, he says, now he arose from the synagogue, that would be Jesus. Now he arose from the synagogue and entered Simon's house. But Simon's wife's mother was sick with a high fever, and they made request of him concerning her. So he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she arose and served them. That's interesting to me, that apparently Jesus had not yet met Peter, had not yet had interaction with Peter, yet he went into Simon's house, Simon Peter, and there his wife's mother, and by implication and omission, right, that Peter was the only one of the apostles that was married. It's the only one that we know of that was married. Don't know of any other one. It never says anything about it. So we have to assume, I think, that Simon Peter was the only one that was married. Simon's wife's mother, that's a hard sentence, but Simon's wife's mother was sick with a high fever. Anyway, I just found that interesting. Chapter 5, verse 1. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret. I had to look that up to see how to pronounce that. It's kind of a neat little app that I have. But the lake of Gennesaret, that's the Sea of Galilee. The lake of Tiberias, all of those. It's all the same thing. Lake of Tiberias, lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee, all the same thing. And he saw 2 boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, Peter's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, Rabbi, my master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with them were astonished at the catch of the fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. There's so much in that little passage right there. Right? So number one, here's a question. When Jesus walked up to he was being pressed by the multitude, right? So picture that for a minute. A great multitude of people following Jesus, and they pressed him kind of against the shoreline, right? And so Jesus, he chose one of the two boats. Did he choose Simon's boat on purpose? Absolutely, right? I mean, it doesn't say it, but I think we're left to assume it. He went and he healed Simon's wife's mother, right, his mother-in-law, before he ever met Simon, right? And now he comes up to the boat. They're cleaning their nets because they've been out all night. And Jesus sees two boats empty, right, and chooses one, happens to be Simon's. I think purposefully chose Simon's boat. You agree? Yeah. Purposefully chose Simon's boat. What does that tell us right there? That he purposefully chose Simon's boat. What does that tell us?
And he was going to put Simon to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Simon, I mean, why? What about Simon in all of the things that we have, that you've read? As you've read the Gospels and all of those things, what about Simon?
Who do you think was in charge of these four partners?
That's a good question, right? Because, say it, who do you think?
I think Simon.
No, I do too. I think his brother Andrew, right, and James and John, the sons of thunder, sons of Zebedee, right? I think he was in charge of it all.
They looked to him to take the lead in whatever they did.
And he was very passionate about things, I think. I think he was very passionate. I mean, in all of the things that you've read and what we're going to look at is that Simon Peter was very passionate about everything that he did. I think he lived on emotion, right?
Yes.
How about this? And they put out, and this is Master, but Simon, see, verse 4. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing." I have heard a lot of people use that statement to denigrate Peter, or to say Peter was complaining or debating with Jesus right there.
I always heard that he's a good fisherman, and he says, not today.
Maybe so. Yes, ma'am.
I think Peter is being,
I think he's tired.
that kind of life, that hardens you, and he's a tough fisherman, but he doesn't fall for things maybe easily, yet he's very passionate, but I think, too, he's not one of these that can easily believe something. I mean, he's very, I gotta see this. I mean, I'm not, and so when he says, look, we worked all night, he's not just, okay, whatever,
Yeah.
he, I don't know what he would say.
I think he was. I think he was.
I think Jesus is trying to build trust with Simon. I think Simon may be a person who does not trust people.
Um,
And so he's done these things, he's worked on building that relationship with Simon. And then I'm sitting there going, well, why Simon? And you know what? I think out of all four of them, I mean, they were cousins. He was probably the leader, the one that they kind of looked to.
mm-hmm.
And maybe Jesus knew that if he had that relationship with Simon, and he knew how important Simon was going to be,
There it is.
but if he had that relationship with Simon, then that's going to engender trust.
It's kind of like with Saul, right? If you get somebody that's this passionate and get them on your side, there's nothing that they can't do. Sarah? It's just, he's tired. I think no. I agree.
He calls him master.
Yep.
And then he's like, we worked so hard all night, I'm not even brother, let's just say
And we just washed our nets.
something. No way.
Right. And we have just washed our nets and ready to go. Now you want me to go and do this again? But the next statement.
That's the next statement.
Yes.
that You have to see.
That's it.
To me,
Mhm.
he wasn't complaining. I think it was just an acknowledgement of how much respect for what Christ was saying to him.
Well, do you think then at that moment that he believed that he was the Christ at that moment?
At that moment, perhaps he didn't believe that he was the Christ, but he recognized the fact that he was someone with authority.
There you go. I agree with that because that next statement,
He just says, hey, even though I've been out here fishing all night,
yeah,
I will obey.
I think it's that simple. And he says, nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. Essentially saying, this early on, I mean, it's just beginning. Whatever you will, I will do. And I will let down the net. And boom, they get the fish. And looking at verse 8. Why am I having problems this morning?
Hadn't these guys been with Jesus' son already?
Don't know. I mean, if you put all of it together, right? I mean, this is the only, in Luke, is the only reference to going in and healing Simon's mother-in-law, right? It's a lot of Simon's wife's mother. But, yeah, and Mark too. That's why I like Mark and Luke. But anyway, yeah, but he says, so I don't know the answer to that question. I don't see any evidence of that. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at verse 8. When Simon Peter saw it, the huge catch of fish that was breaking their nets and sinking the boat, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Now, what do you suppose he meant by, "O Lord"? What do you suppose he meant by that? So if you look at, and I'm not saying this is a feudal society, but I'm going to use that as an illustration. If you look at a feudal society, back in, say, the Middle Ages, right? In the 1500s, 1400s, right? The king owned it all. You had some earls, some barons, that sort of thing. They all, then they had people that worked the farms and did all of those things, and they were subject to being called up to go to war and all those things. And they called people Lord, right? They called people Lord. That baron, that earl, that whatever was your Lord. So I think he's using it. Do you suppose he's using it in that context? Lord, my master, in that case? Or do I recognize you now as a deity? That's well said. As a deity. I was going to say as God made man, but I.
Performed. He's seen the miracle performed.
Mm-hmm.
Now he is accepting him or recognizing him as his deity.
See, I'll agree with that. I'll agree with that because he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." He recognizes the miracle that just happened for what it was. I got you. The miracle for exactly what it was. He also recognized that Jesus was holy. And holy means one set apart, right? As opposed to sanctified, which means purified. Yes, ma'am.
Andrew's the one who came and told Simon Peter
Yeah,
he found the Messiah, right?
initially.
Can we say that happened before this?
I say so.
And therefore, with Andrew being there, said, "Hey, Simon, this is the guy I was telling you about." And therefore, he could recognize him at this point as the Messiah.
I think so. I think so. I agree with you 100%. Because he recognizes him as one set apart, right? Because he just did this miracle. He recognizes in himself that he is not that. He is neither set apart, holy, nor is he pure. He recognizes his own sinful nature.
And in the Old Testament, everyone was taught about the Messiah going to show up one day.
Mm-hmm.
And Andrew says, "We have found the Messiah."
Mm-hmm.
And John,
Come and see. Yeah. Yeah. Say it again. It's possible, right? Now go to verses 9. We're going to look at verses 9 to 11 a little bit deeper. For he, this was talking about Peter, for he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And look at this, and I underline this, because they're all four there with that multitude that saw it all, right? And Jesus said to Simon, right? He wasn't specifically addressing all four of them at one time, but he said, and Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. So Simon, Peter, was the first disciple to be called. Jesus said to Simon, he was the first one, right? And Jesus spoke directly to Peter. Now think about that a minute. Now think about what they forsook. They forsook all. They had just brought in the biggest catch of fish that anybody had ever seen. Massive profit, right? Massive profit. Left it on the shore, right? Because it says they forsook all and followed him. All the money that they had just made, left it on the shore. Their boats, left it. Their nets, left them on the shore. Mom, Dad, left them on the shore. They forsook all and followed Jesus. They just became the disciples of a rabbi, right? Because Jesus was that, right? And they went from town to town. They put the camps up. They took the camps down. They cooked food. They taught. They studied. They served their master. From that point forward, they forsook all. Total trust in Jesus at that moment. Compare that. Turn with me to John chapter 21. And this is to set that context, right? And we're going to look at verses 1 through 7. So compare this with what we just read in Luke about that miraculous catch of fish. Jesus had appeared, first to the women, right? And then to the apostles, and then to the multitudes, right? After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. Remember what I said? The Lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, Lake Tiberias, all the same thing, in the same place. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, you can picture this, sitting on the shore. He says, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we're going to go with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? And they answered, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish, which, by the way, was 153. Very specific, 153 fish, if you go over to that. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, and we assume that's John, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, about 200 cubits, dragging the net with them. This same Peter, who in Luke, at the beginning of this, Jesus was talking directly to him. He said, do not be afraid, for from now on you will catch men. And they forsook all and followed him. This same Peter, when he realized that it was Jesus on the shore that had just done the same thing, put on his cloak, jumped into the water, and swam after Jesus. to be with him again. Now that's phenomenal to me. Peter was a great, great disciple. So, what does that mean for us? We can learn a lot from Simon Peter, and I think we're going to. We should respond to Jesus the way Simon responded to Jesus. We should be disciples. We should be students. We should be pupils. We should be teachers because they taught. And we should be servants of Jesus. So that's today's lesson. Any other comments? I went a little over. I apologize.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you all.